A path leading nowhere is still a clue. Welcome to Eco Misteriosa. I am your host, Ervella. Tell me in the comments where you're listening. It's always a joy to read. Your voices make this journey special. Let's begin. It was on a gusty morning in early October of the year 1891 that I found myself once more amidst the book-laden quiet of Baker Street, staring at the lean silhouette of Sherlock Holmes as he stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, eyes trained not on the street below, but upon some unseen diagram of thought drawn across the fog-streaked glass. "I trust you have no immediate engagements, Watson," he said without turning. His voice, cool and clipped, pierced the silence like the snap of a violin string. "I was in fact considering a visit to my club," I replied, removing my gloves. "But I suspect by the tone of your question that those plans may be subject to revision." "Quite so. We are summoned to Highbury Lane by none other than Inspector Lestrade. A matter of most curious nature. A gentleman dead in a locked garden, his footprints circling a single tree twice and then vanishing entirely. No sign of struggle, no witnesses, and no clear means of entry or exit." "A locked garden, you say?" I asked, my interest quickening. "And footprints that go in circles?" "Indeed," Holmes said, finally turning toward me. His eyes gleamed with that fierce light I had come to associate with intellectual delight. "A man found quite inexplicably, dead in a place he could not have entered without a key, with no marks upon him, save for a faint bruise at the temple. The key was in his pocket. The only footprints in the garden are his own, 2 perfect circles, and then nothing, no more, as if he vanished into thin air." "A stroke?" I offered tentatively. Holmes waved this aside. "The local constable thought the same. Lestrade suspects murder. But Watson, I suspect a far more elaborate mechanism is at play, shall we?" Within the hour we had boarded a cab and made our way through the swirling grey veil of London's morning fog down toward Highbury Lane. The address in question was number 39, a stout red brick house with iron railings, neatly trimmed hedges, and an air of respectability tinged with unease. Already a small crowd had gathered, murmuring among themselves in the way of Londoners when death, scandal, and police converge. Lestrade met us at the gate, his familiar face creased with irritation and fatigue. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. Doctor, I'm glad you're here. This one's turned every constable in the division into a philosopher. I need someone who can give me a plain answer." "You need someone, Lestrade," said Holmes, "who can ask the right questions. Now, show me the body." We followed him through the house and out to a small walled garden at the rear, perfectly enclosed, with a single wrought-iron gate bolted from the inside and no windows facing directly in. There, lying in the damp grass beneath an ancient elm, was the deceased, a man in his 40s, well dressed in tweed, with silver at his temples and a respectable watch chain across his vest. Holmes crouched beside the body and examined it with a rapid precision that left me, as ever, both humbled and puzzled. No soil beneath the fingernails. The hands are uncalloused, unused to manual labor. One bruise, not recent, near the left temple. The pupils are slightly dilated. "Name's Mr. Archibald Baxter," Lestrade supplied. "Solicitor. Lived here alone since his wife passed. Neighbors say he was a quiet, solitary sort. Came out here last night sometime after dusk. This morning the maid found him as you see him, dead under the tree." "And the footprints?" Holmes asked. "Just the one set, his," Lestrade said, pointing. "They circle the tree once, then again, and then stop. No marks leading away, no one else in or out. Gate was bolted. Key was in his pocket." Holmes rose, his expression unreadable. "Let me see the path in full daylight, and then I should like a word with the maid." As we examined the delicate prints in the grass, unmistakably made by a man's polished boots, I could not suppress a shiver. The path truly did lead in 2 perfect circles, worn crisp impressions around the elm, and then simply ceased. "There's something wrong here, Holmes," I murmured. He nodded, eyes on the path. "Yes, Watson, there is something very wrong here. It is the sort of wrongness that does not come from chance. It is orchestrated. And yet what could it mean?" He straightened suddenly, glancing toward the house. "It means, my dear Watson, that we are not looking at the scene of a spontaneous act. We are looking at a performance, and every performance has an audience or a purpose. He turned sharply. Come, let us speak to the maid. The dead man's last steps may have been in circles, but I rather think the truth moves in a straight line. Holmes requested to speak with the maid, a timid young woman named Clara Hensley, who stood wringing her hands in the back parlour, eyes darting toward the garden with barely concealed fear. Lestrade remained with the constable in the yard, murmuring to another officer, while Holmes and I stepped inside with her. You were the one who discovered the body? Holmes asked gently but firmly. Clara nodded. Yes, sir. Just after 7 this morning. I always open the curtains first thing and check on the garden. Mr. Baxter liked his solitude, but he also liked things tidy. I noticed the gate was still bolted and thought he might already be out there. But then I saw him on the grass, and I knew something was wrong straight away. You say the gate was bolted? Holmes asked. From the inside? It's always bolted that way, sir. Only Mr. Baxter and I had keys, and mine never leaves my apron pocket. Holmes gestured toward the silver chain that hung from her waist. She drew a small iron key from the fold of the cloth and handed it to him. He examined it briefly, returned it, then motioned for her to continue. Did you hear anything unusual last night? She hesitated. No voices, no shouting, if that's what you mean, but... She glanced nervously between us. There was something odd. Around 8:30, I was in the kitchen at the back. I thought I heard a sort of humming noise, not loud, like a man talking to himself under his breath. I thought it was Mr. Baxter, perhaps taking a walk in the garden, so I didn't look, but then it stopped very suddenly. That was all. Holmes's brow furrowed ever so slightly. Did Mr. Baxter have visitors yesterday? No, sir. None, that I saw. Anyone he corresponded with regularly? Friends, family? His sister, Miss Edith Baxter. She lives in Marylebone and writes once a week, but she hasn't visited since the summer. Mr. Baxter kept mostly to himself. He was careful, always checking the locks, didn't like unexpected callers. What about his work, I asked. Did he have clients who might have wished him harm? Mr. Baxter rarely had clients at the house. Most of his legal business was conducted in his chambers in Lincoln's Inn. I do not know much beyond that, sir. Holmes regarded the girl with his penetrating gaze, then nodded once. That will be all, Miss Hensley. You've been most helpful. As she departed, Holmes drew a cigarette from his case and stood silently by the fireplace. The faint tick of the mantel clock echoed through the room. You are thinking of the sound she described, I said. Yes, Watson. The humming. It is the first note of irregularity. Mr. Baxter's habits were meticulous. He would not have wandered in circles while humming to himself, certainly not twice around the same tree before lying down to die, unless he was drugged, hallucinating. A possibility, but consider, what does it mean that there were no marks on the grass leading in or out of the garden besides his own? No break in the wall. The door bolted from within. Yet he did not kill himself. There are no wounds, no sign of poison near the body. The faint bruise suggests a blow, but not one strong enough to fell him. No, Watson, this is not the scene of a frenzied attack. It is a constructed tableau. And like all constructed things, it has an architect. He stepped briskly back toward the garden, beckoning me to follow. I must re-examine the footprints. We returned to the grass where the body had been respectfully removed by the constables. The prints remained clearly visible in the dew-slicked lawn. Holmes walked the path slowly, hands behind his back, eyes scanning each indentation. 2. Perfect circles, I remarked, each step neat and measured, not the pace of a confused or panicked man. Quite so, Holmes replied. And notice this. He stopped and pointed to the third step after the second circuit. A deeper impression than the others. I bent closer. Yes, it's heavier. He stood here longer, perhaps hesitated. And this. He moved several feet along. The next step is lighter, as though he shifted weight. And then the prints stop. Nowhere to go. And yet here he lay. Here he lay. It is as though he followed instructions, I said quietly. Deliberate steps, as if acting out a command. Holmes gave me a quick nod of approval. You are learning, Watson. Now imagine this. What would compel a man, fastidious and solitary, To walk in circles under a tree at night and then lie down and die. Not fear, there is no panic in his movement. Not despair, there are no signs of suicide. But perhaps he believed he was being watched or guided. Hypnotism? I asked, uncertainly. Holmes arched a brow. Possible, but unlikely. No evidence yet of a mesmerist. I lean instead toward suggestion, manipulation. Let us consider the victim's last known actions. He turned back toward Lestrade, who was now inspecting the gate lock with 2 constables. Lestrade, I must... See Mr. Baxter's study, Holmes called, and all correspondence received in the past 3 days. The inspector, though clearly irritated at the whirlwind pace of Holmes's thinking, complied. We were led upstairs into a well-kept study, neat rows of bookshelves, a large writing desk and a globe in the corner with dust on its latitude. On the desk were 2 neatly stacked letters. Holmes examined them. One from the tax office, the other from a Miss E. Fenchurch. Curious. He opened the second letter. I moved beside him and read, My dear Mr. Baxter, you once promised to help me should the day come that I found myself in fear. That day has come. If you value the memory of what we shared, come to the garden at 9 o'clock. Alone, do not bring light, do not speak. Simply walk until I reveal myself. Ever yours, E. F. Holmes let out a low whistle and handed the letter to Lestrade. Well, Inspector, our late solicitor may have been far less solitary than he appeared. Lestrade scowled. We'll need to trace this E. Fenchurch. Could be a trap, plain and simple. Or a decoy, Holmes murmured. A false trail designed to draw him out, step by step. Lestrade gestured to a constable. Get word to the Central Registry. See what you can find on that name. Friends, clients, sweethearts. Check his will while you're at it. Holmes turned back to the window, gazing toward the elm whose branches moved gently in the wind. The sun had risen higher now, warming the mist that clung to the garden. A blackbird called once, then fell silent. Do. You notice, Watson, he said, that the garden is perfectly square. I glanced out. Yes, walled on all sides, and that the tree stands precisely in the center. No visible purpose for the path, no benches, no flower beds, just the tree, and the 2 circles. You believe the location itself was chosen with care, I am certain of it. A man like Baxter does not pace a ritual path without instruction. He was lured here under emotional pretenses, perhaps love, perhaps guilt. The letter appeals not to reason, but to sentiment. Whoever sent it knew him intimately, or knew enough to mimic intimacy. I nodded. Then the sender is our first suspect. Holmes turned, smiling faintly. Indeed, Watson. The game begins. But we must not make the mistake of assuming this. Miss Fenchurch exists. The deeper the deception, the more convincing the fiction must be. And if the path led Mr. Baxter in circles, then I suspect our investigation must do the opposite. He turned on his heel. Come, we must speak with Miss Edith Baxter at once. There are questions she may not realize she holds the answers to. And with that, we departed the quiet house on Highbury Lane, leaving behind the faint, eerie pattern of footprints in the grass, like the echo of a man who had walked to his own death while chasing something that was never truly there. The hansom cab rattled over damp cobbles as we turned north toward Marylebone. Holmes sat in silence, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the air between us. I had come to recognize this state, a peculiar stillness that meant his mind was working furiously beneath the surface, assembling fragments of perception into coherent shape. I respected the silence and allowed my own thoughts to drift across the puzzle. The letter had been precise. Come to the garden at 9 o'clock. Do not bring light, do not speak. A deliberate orchestration of vulnerability. But there was no signature beyond the initials, E.F., and Holmes had wisely reminded us not to assume Miss Fenchurch was a real person. Perhaps it was an invented name, crafted by someone who knew just enough of Archibald Baxter's past to manipulate him with it, or worse, a person he truly once trusted. Holmes broke the silence at last. The letter, Watson. What strikes you most? I considered. The tone. Intimate. Urgent. It presumes an emotional bond. Yet it's vague enough that no particular moment or memory is mentioned. Exactly. a baited hook, enough sentiment to ensnare a man prone to guilt or nostalgia, but with the prudence of a writer who does not wish to be identified should the letter fall into the wrong hands. Then we must determine what guilt or nostalgia Baxter carried, and whether Miss Edith Baxter can tell us more. Holmes gave a brief nod. She may not know the truth, but she may provide us the map. By the time we arrived at her townhouse, the fog had begun to lift, revealing a pale, chill sky. The residence was modest, well-kept, and quietly genteel. A maid led us to a parlour where Miss Edith Baxter sat reading a copy of the Illustrated London News. She was a woman of perhaps 55, with tightly drawn grey hair and the upright carriage of someone long accustomed to bearing responsibility. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said as we entered. Her voice was level, though her eyes, like her brother's, carried something guarded. "Inspector Lestrade wired me to expect you. I take it this concerns Archibald?" Holmes inclined his head. "It does, Miss Baxter. I regret that our errand is not of a happier nature. Your brother was found dead in his garden early this morning. I offer you my condolences." She received the news with composed silence, only a faint tightening around her mouth betraying any emotion. I had feared as much when I received no reply to my letter last week. Archie was troubled in recent years, withdrawn, but he would not ignore me without reason. "You say he was troubled," Holmes prompted. "May I ask what caused that?" She sighed. "It's difficult to explain. My brother had a natural suspicion of people. He didn't make friends easily, though. He was kind in his own quiet way. After his wife passed, well, he never quite recovered. He spent more time alone, buried himself in work, stopped visiting. I worried he was growing paranoid. He began locking everything, doors, drawers, even letters." "Did he speak of anyone? Who concerned him?" "There was one man," she said after a moment's thought. "He never gave a name, but he mentioned once, cryptically, that a client had placed him in a difficult position. A matter of conscience, he said. I asked if it was about money, embezzlement, or some fraud. He replied only that it was not about the law, but about trust. I took it to mean blackmail, but he would not say more." "Did he have any romantic entanglements in recent years?" "None that I know of. Archie was not the sort to fall easily. Though," she hesitated, "there was someone long ago, before his marriage, a Miss Evelyn Fenchurch. I never met her. All I know is they were briefly engaged. Then something happened, he would not say what, and she vanished from his life entirely. That was nearly 20 years ago." I exchanged a glance with Holmes, who leaned forward slightly. "You say he never mentioned her again?" "Not in detail. Once, when I asked why he had never remarried, he replied, 'Because ghosts do not make good company for the living.' I assumed he meant his wife. But now, perhaps not." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Miss Baxter, do you still possess any letters from your brother, or from this Miss Fenchurch?" "Only Archie's. I keep them in a box upstairs. I can fetch them, if you please." She departed, and Holmes rose and paced the carpet. "So she did exist," I said, "or someone by that name did. But notice, Watson, how conveniently the name returns now, in the form of an unsigned letter. Either Miss Fenchurch is genuinely back after 20 years to lure him into the garden, or someone knows his past well enough to impersonate her convincingly, and that suggests a connection closer than casual acquaintance. Miss Baxter returned presently with a small wooden box and placed it on the table. Holmes lifted the lid. Inside were a dozen or so letters, neatly tied with twine, bearing postmarks from various points across London. He untied the bundle and began scanning. Most were routine updates, brief, almost curt. "Hope this finds you well," or "Enclosed are the documents you requested." But the last letter, dated just 6 months prior, was more curious. "Edith, there's been a development I cannot yet speak of. It concerns the past, something long buried. If anything should happen to me, I beg you, search the blue folio in the study drawer. Destroy what you find there. Some things are best forgotten." Your brother, A. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Watson, do you recall the study desk at Highbury Lane?" "Yes, 3 drawers on either side." "Did you see a blue folio?" "I did not. The drawers were locked. If I recall, then we must open them. We left Miss Baxter with further reassurances and returned post-haste to Highbury Lane. By the time we arrived, dusk had begun to set in, casting long shadows across the garden. Lestrade was still on the premises, sorting through papers with a constable. "We need access to Baxter's desk," Holmes informed him at once, "specifically the locked drawers." "We were going to send for a locksmith," Lestrade muttered, "but I suppose you'll want first look." Holmes produced a small set of slender tools from his coat pocket and made quick work of the central lock. Within minutes the drawer slid open, revealing several folders. Near the back, a thin, leather-bound folio with blue trimming lay beneath, a sheet of blotting paper. Holmes extracted it with care. Inside were a collection of typewritten notes, some correspondence, some contracts. But what drew his attention was a single page marked "Private, 1871" in faded pencil. It read, "To whom it may concern, the documents enclosed pertain to the estate of the late Lady Evangeline Fairfax, executor Archibald Baxter, Esq. Of note, the will was altered shortly before her death, removing a named beneficiary, E.F., without explanation. The original beneficiary contested the change, but was never officially heard. The file was sealed, by private arrangement and never reopened, filed under discretion, not for court disclosure." I leaned over his shoulder. "E.F., Evelyn Fenchurch." Holmes's face darkened. "A motive, Watson. If Miss Fenchurch was cut from an inheritance, and Baxter had a hand in it, either willingly or under pressure, then there is a reason for revenge. After all these years, revenge does not obey time, nor does guilt, but this raises a further possibility. What if someone else discovered this file and used it to impersonate her, to blackmail him?" He turned sharply. "Lestrade, we must find all associates of Lady Fairfax's estate, particularly those who might have had access to sealed documents, and we must know if Evelyn Fenchurch is alive, or if someone merely wants us to think she is." As Holmes slipped the blue folio into his coat, I looked once more at the study, at the neat lines of dust, the order so careful it felt almost brittle. The sort of place, I thought, where secrets could survive for decades, undisturbed, until someone came to dig them out, and somewhere out in the gathering night of London, someone already knew we were looking. We returned to Baker Street that evening beneath a velvet sky heavy with low, drifting clouds, the streets glistening with the residue of an earlier rain. Holmes had spoken scarcely a word since we left Highbury Lane, and now that we were back in the familiar confines of our sitting room, he sat cross-legged upon the hearthrug, violin across his knees, the unplayed bow in one hand, the folio resting on the floor beside him. A small fire cast dancing light upon the walls, and I could see the rhythm of his mind, pulsing beneath his still exterior like the slow coiling of a spring. He stirred at last. "Watson, do you recall the phrase, 'Some things are best forgotten'? Of course, it was in Baxter's final letter to his sister." "Yes. A man writes that only when he believes remembering would cause harm, either to himself or to others. In this case, I believe it was both. And that sealed document in the folio confirms a key suspicion. Baxter was involved in the redirection of a will, almost certainly under dubious circumstances." I leaned forward, elbows on my knees. "You think he falsified it?" "Possibly. But what interests me more is the name, Lady Evangeline Fairfax. She died, as the document stated, in 1871. That is nearly 20 years ago, yet the repercussions of her estate still reverberate enough to lure a man to his death. Do we know anything of her family?" Holmes reached for the post office directory, a thick tome perpetually stationed near the desk. Flipping swiftly through its pages, he traced a fingertip along a column and grunted softly. "Here, Lady Evangeline Fairfax, widow of Sir Thomas Fairfax, late of Worthing and South Audley Street. No children listed. Her heir presumptive was a cousin, one Edwin Moresby, a solicitor himself, interestingly. But if Miss Fenchurch had been a beneficiary before the will was altered, then she, too, must have had a connection. Family, perhaps, or a ward, something close enough to warrant her inclusion." He rose with sudden decision and rang for Mrs. Hudson. "A telegram to the probate office, if you would, Mrs. Hudson," he instructed when she entered. "Request the sealed details of Lady Fairfax's 1871 will, along with any related estate. Litigation. Mention that we act with Scotland Yard's cooperation and that the urgency pertains to a suspicious death under police inquiry." As she nodded and left, Holmes turned to me. "While we await the official channels, we must explore more direct ones. I have an idea, but it requires some delicacy." "I am at your service," I said. "Good. Then you shall come with me tomorrow morning to the Law Society's archive. They are less scrupulous than the probate office and more susceptible to a name dropped at the right angle. I believe we shall find traces of Evelyn Fenchurch, either as claimant, witness, or aggrieved party." We rose early the next day and arrived at the archives in Chancery Lane shortly after opening. It was a cavernous building of stone and soot, warmed slightly by coal grates and humming with clerks. Holmes approached a desk clerk, his tone warm and vaguely impatient, and within minutes we were seated at a table with several thick record books before us. Holmes leafed through one marked Estate Disputes, 1870-1875, and made a pleased sound. Here it is. Fairfax v. Fenchurch, 1871, closed in 1872. The plaintiff, Miss Evelyn Fenchurch, contested a sudden removal from the will, alleging undue influence. The court refused to hear the case on grounds that the amendment was signed and witnessed. Legally, no judgment was rendered in her favor. I took the file from him and scanned the page. Here, she was living at the time in an address in Chelsea. Holmes nodded. "Then that is our next call. If the address no longer holds her, perhaps it holds a clue to where she went. And, Watson, note the date of the will's amendment. Only 10 days before Lady Fairfax's death. Suspicious, is it not?" "Very," I murmured. "She would have been quite ill by then, easily influenced or coerced." We arrived at the Chelsea address by noon. It was a small townhouse now broken into flats. A landlady met us at the door, wiping flour from her hands and peering at us with no small suspicion. Holmes explained that we were attempting to trace a former resident, Miss Evelyn Fenchurch, and asked if she might recall the name. "Fenchurch," she repeated, brows drawing together. "Yes, I do remember that name. She lived here, must be over 20 years ago. A pretty young woman, very quiet. Paid her rent on time. Then one day, she was gone. No word. Just left. I assumed she'd had a change of fortune, poor thing. Her letters stopped arriving not long after." "Did anyone ever come asking about her?" Holmes asked. "About her?" Her eyes narrowed. "Only once, years ago. A man in a dark coat, older, I think, stern-faced, not the sort you forget. Asked a few questions, but he left looking unsatisfied." Holmes pressed. "You remember his name?" "No, but he smelled of tobacco and carried a walking stick with a silver top. I remember that, at least." Holmes and I exchanged a glance. "Could have been Baxter," I whispered. "Or someone watching for Baxter," Holmes replied softly. Back. On the street, Holmes's mood had shifted. There was a new keenness to his eyes, a spark that meant something had clicked. "She was erased," he said at last. "Intentionally and efficiently. Removed from the will, from correspondence, from legal contention. Someone wanted her forgotten. But what if she never stopped watching? What if out of sight she waited until someone opened the past again?" "But Baxter himself seemed frightened," I said. "Why not come forward earlier if she wanted?" "Justice, because she had already failed through legal means. Perhaps she spent years searching for proof. Or perhaps, Watson, consider this, perhaps it was not Miss Fenchurch at all. Perhaps another party gained access to the folio, a descendant of Fenchurch, a rival solicitor, someone who uncovered the original grievance and decided it was a lever, worth using." We returned to Baker Street just before twilight. A telegram awaited Holmes on the mantel. He read it with narrowed eyes. "From the probate office," he said. "Confirmation. The original will did name Evelyn Fenchurch as primary beneficiary. The amendment redirected everything to Edwin Moresby, the cousin." I frowned. "Moresby, he was mentioned as an heir in the post office directory." "Indeed. A solicitor, likely influential. And Baxter would have been the man responsible for overseeing the amendment, which means he may have bowed to pressure or acted in concert. Then perhaps Miss Fenchurch's disappearance was not by choice." Holmes stood very still. If she resisted, Watson, if she fought the amendment, then there's every possibility that her vanishing was arranged, not just socially but fatally. A silence settled between us. Outside, the gaslights flickered in the rising dusk. Holmes turned abruptly and took up his violin. The bow moved. Gently across the strings, a slow, thoughtful cadence, not one of triumph but of deepening complexity. "There is someone else in this play, Watson," he murmured. "We are being watched." The moment we touched the blue folio, the pieces began to shift. And the circle Mr. Baxter walked, it was not only literal. He was being led back to something he thought he had buried. I said nothing. The tune grew, slower, then ceased entirely. Holmes set the violin aside and looked to the window. "We must find Edwin Moresby." We found Edwin Moresby 2 days later, in chambers off Gray's Inn Road. An address Holmes had extracted through a solicitor's directory while sipping tea with the absent-minded detachment of a chess master anticipating the next sacrifice. Moresby's name had appeared in several estate filings over the years, always, Holmes noted, as either executor or beneficiary, and often in cases where elderly clients had altered their wills late in life. It was a pattern, Holmes said quietly, that would look quite innocent, unless someone knew precisely where to look. The offices were unassuming, the kind of clean but forgettable establishment that might pass unnoticed to all but taxmen and tired clients. Moresby received us in a modest consultation room lined with law books and dustless shelves. He was a lean man in his early 60s, with close-cut grey hair and a manner that was both precise and faintly condescending. His fingers steepled tightly under his chin as Holmes introduced himself and offered the pretext of reviewing an old estate connected to Lady Fairfax. "Of course," Moresby said. "Her affairs were settled decades ago. I remember the matter clearly. Tragic case, really. The lady suffered terribly toward the end. As her cousin, I did what I could." "You were named as her sole beneficiary, I believe?" Holmes asked. "Mildly. Yes, that was Lady Fairfax's wish, clarified in her final instructions. It was my understanding that the transition of the estate was legally sound and executed with the full cooperation of her solicitor." Holmes smiled faintly. "Archibald Baxter, yes, a man now dead, rather unexpectedly. You must have heard." Moresby hesitated, just long enough to matter. "I had not. How unfortunate." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "You knew him?" "In passing. We corresponded over the matter of Lady Fairfax's will, but he was merely the legal hand involved. I wouldn't say we were close." "And Evelyn Fenchurch?" Holmes asked quietly. There was the briefest twitch in Moresby's brow. He was a practiced man, but not immune. "I recall the name. She made a claim upon the estate which the courts declined to pursue. As far as I know, she faded into obscurity thereafter. It was a merciful outcome. The matter was delicate." "In what sense?" "She was not of sound temperament, Mr. Holmes, emotional, unstable even. Her claim was tenuous at best, and the court agreed." Holmes's tone remained even. "You say she faded into obscurity, but might it not be more accurate to say she was deliberately erased?" Moresby's smile did not falter, but it thinned. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying, I'm observing," Holmes replied, rising. "We appreciate your time. One final question. Would you object to our reviewing the correspondence between yourself and Mr. Baxter concerning the estate?" Moresby's response was smooth and immediate. "Not at all, though I doubt they will prove enlightening. The details were routine." "I find routine can be most revealing," Holmes murmured. As we stepped back into the street, the late afternoon sun was filtered through low clouds, casting a tarnished glow on the rooftops. "He's lying," Holmes said. "I gathered," I replied dryly. "But about which part?" "About everything that matters. His reaction to Baxter's name was staged. The twitch at the mention of Miss Fenchurch was genuine, and the insistence on her instability, too rehearsed. He's managing a narrative, which means he fears it being rewritten. But to what end? To preserve his inheritance? Possibly, or to cover something darker. If Miss Fenchurch had evidence of coercion, if she could prove her removal from the will was influenced by Moresby, then his claim would crumble. The law may have closed the matter, but a resurrection of that evidence would still be ruinous." I nodded. And Baxter would have held that proof, the folio. Precisely, which means Baxter's death was not merely a revenge, but a clean-up. Holmes halted suddenly. "Watson, we must speak to Edith Baxter again. If her brother feared what he knew, he may have left breadcrumbs. I suspect he was beginning to prepare for something, perhaps even knew he was being watched. When we arrived at the Marylebone address, Miss Baxter welcomed us with visible strain etched across her face. She had received word of the ongoing investigation and seemed relieved to see us. "There is something I didn't think important at first," she said, as she led us inside. "But in light of everything, perhaps it matters." She retrieved a small bundle of papers from a drawer. "Archie sent me these 3 weeks ago. No note, no explanation, just the documents. I assumed it was part of his usual fussiness, records to be kept. But one of the envelopes was marked, 'To be opened.' Only if something should happen to me. I hadn't opened it until now." She handed Holmes a yellowed envelope with the familiar, steady handwriting. Holmes opened it carefully and drew out a single sheet, neatly folded. He read it aloud. "Edith, if you are reading this, it means I have not succeeded in untangling what I began. There is a danger that someone may try to silence me. I no longer believe Evelyn Fenchurch is dead. I think she or someone claiming her name has returned, and I think Moresby knows. The documents enclosed may help. Guard them well. Forgive me for what I did all those years ago. I was not brave then. Perhaps I can be now." Archie Holmes's mouth drew into a grim line as he examined the other documents, copies of letters, signatures, and a journal entry from 1871 in Baxter's own hand, describing a visit to Lady Fairfax's bedside in which she seemed pressured and confused about the changes to her will. "This," Holmes said, "is enough to expose Moresby, perhaps even to have the estate re-examined, and someone wanted to make sure it never surfaced." As we departed, Holmes's pace quickened. He hailed a cab and directed it not to Baker Street but towards Scotland Yard. "We need Lestrade," he said. "Moresby has motive and means. He knew about the folio. He feared exposure. He lured Baxter out with the letter, or arranged for someone else to do it, and ensured his silence. But who delivered the letter? Surely Moresby wouldn't risk writing it himself. Just so. Which brings us to a missing piece. Someone else is involved. A proxy. Perhaps a clerk, a servant, a loyal associate, someone who could mimic handwriting, deliver letters, erase tracks. Someone intimate enough with Baxter's habits to know he would respond to such a summons. Someone who could arrange the scene, perhaps even administer a drug to disorient him. The thought chilled me. Then Baxter may have been alive when he walked those circles. Almost certainly, Holmes said. But he was not walking freely. He was performing a ritual, one he believed meant something. Perhaps a reunion, perhaps a confession. Instead, it became a grave. At Scotland Yard, Lestrade met us with a mixture of relief and skepticism. Moresby, that silk-tied solicitor? He's got friends in half the clubs in the city, Holmes. Handed him the letter and the attached documents. Then best we move before those friends are warned. Baxter feared this man. He died holding his secret. Now we hold it instead. Lestrade reviewed the letter, his expression darkening. This is enough for a warrant. I'll send men to search Moresby's chambers. Holmes stopped him. Wait. Let him come to us. He believes Baxter's secret is buried. But if word leaks just subtly enough that someone has seen the folio, he may come to retrieve it himself. You want to set a trap? Holmes's smile was sharp and cold. No, Inspector. I want to give him a choice. A man who kills in the dark thinks himself invisible, but even shadows vanish under the right light. And so that night we prepared the bait. The blue folio was returned to Baxter's study. A whisper was placed in the right quarter of legal circles, a whisper that the solicitor's death had not closed the case but opened it. Then we waited. And the trap was set. Holmes and I returned once more to the house at Highbury Lane, this time under the shroud of evening. The street was quiet, the windows shuttered, and a faint mist crept in low over the hedgerows. Inside, all had been restored to order, save for the study. There, by Holmes's arrangement, the blue folio had been returned to its drawer, not hidden, but resting suggestively on the desk as if recently disturbed. A single lamp glowed in the corner, casting shadows that danced like whispers across the walls. Lestrade had posted 2 plainclothes men in the garden, concealed among the hedges. Holmes, meanwhile, took position behind the parlour curtain, its folds offering a sliver of vantage toward the study door. I remained seated near the fireplace, pretending to read the newspaper, the tension in my spine growing with every tick of the clock. Holmes had been precise in the execution of the trap. "The bait must seem unguarded," he had said. "But not too obviously. Let the man think himself clever for arriving first, and he will not look over his shoulder." The hours passed slowly. 11 o'clock came and went. Midnight stirred, and the house remained still but for the occasional creak of wood and distant bark of a dog. I was beginning to wonder whether our ruse had been too subtle when Holmes stiffened. He raised a single finger for silence. A faint sound, barely perceptible, filtered in from the rear of the house. The garden gate, though rusted and stiff, had opened with unnatural care. Another pause. Then a floorboard in the hallway sighed gently beneath a careful footfall. Holmes slipped from the curtain like a wraith and pressed his back against the wall near the study door. He gestured for me to remain where I was, but I had already set down my paper and moved silently to the far corner, half shrouded by shadow. The intruder entered without light, just as we had anticipated. He moved with the confidence of familiarity, his steps deliberate and slow. He wore a dark overcoat and gloves, and though his features were hidden beneath a low brim, there was no mistaking the silver-headed cane tucked under his arm. Edwin Moresby. He approached the desk, opened the drawer, and withdrew the blue folio. He rifled through it quickly, then stopped. I could see his breath quicken, his chest rising sharply. His lips moved, muttering perhaps, and his gloved hand trembled for the briefest moment. That was when Holmes stepped forward, closing the door behind him with a decisive click. "Good evening, Mr. Moresby," he said calmly. "I believe you've found what you were looking for." Moresby turned, startled, but even now he managed to maintain a modicum of composure. "This is outrageous," he said coolly. "I was invited here, a solicitor from the probate office. He asked me to retrieve the relevant documentation." "No such invitation was extended," Holmes replied. "The room was sealed. Only 3 men had access to the key. You were not one of them." Moresby's eyes narrowed. "You have no right to detain me." "Quite the opposite," came Lestrade's voice as he entered from the garden door, pistol drawn and moustache bristling with suppressed satisfaction. "I've a warrant signed just this evening, and I've 6 men waiting to search your offices." Moresby faltered. His gaze flicked between Holmes, Lestrade, and the folio in his hands. "It was self-preservation," he said at last, his voice lower now, stripped of its professional polish. "That's all. I didn't kill him. I swear that to you." Holmes stepped forward, his tone still level. "But you led him there. You or someone under your instruction delivered the letter. You crafted the words to draw him out with false sentiment under the pretense that Miss Fenchurch had returned." Moresby did not deny it. He began asking questions, he said. "He told me he had uncovered something, that he was going to speak to the Bar Association. I couldn't allow it. I didn't mean for him to die. Only to be frightened, to disappear from the scene for a time. But the man I sent, he was too thorough." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You sent someone?" "A clerk," Moresby said, defeated. "A man named Harlan Gibbs. He'd worked for me for years. Discreet, clever. He wrote the letter, delivered it. I instructed him to convince Baxter to disappear, perhaps to leave London. We concocted the story of Evelyn's return, but what happened afterward, that was not my plan." Lestrade snapped his fingers. "I want this Gibbs found immediately. If he's in London, we'll have him before dawn." Holmes looked grave. "You say he was clever. That worries me more than you know." Moresby was removed under guard, the folio retrieved and secured. But Holmes did not rest. We returned to Baker Street, the gas lamps flickering mournfully in the mist. He sat in his chair, hands steepled, eyes on the fire. "It's not finished," he said at length. "But we have Moresby," I replied. "He orchestrated the letter. He had motive. He feared discovery. Yes, but he lacked precision. He intended manipulation, not murder. His confession rings true, Watson. He thought the lie would drive Baxter to flight, not to death. Which leaves us with Mr. Harlan Gibbs, a man who acted with cold efficiency and vanished with equal skill. I leaned forward. Do you believe Gibbs acted on his own? That he had a separate purpose? I believe Gibbs was not merely an instrument. I believe he had his own designs. Perhaps he learned more than Moresby suspected. Perhaps he found something in Baxter's files, something worth silencing him over. And there's one thing still missing. What? The truth about Evelyn Fenchurch. Is she truly gone, or was she found? A long silence followed. Holmes stared into the fire. If she is dead, he said quietly, then someone made her disappear long ago. If she is alive, then someone may have found her, or what remains of her claim. Either way, someone has been watching the past, waiting for it to resurface, and Baxter's death was the first ripple. He stood suddenly and went to the desk. We must find Harlan Gibbs, not merely to charge him, but to understand who he is and who he works for. I have a theory, Watson, but I need facts. He pulled out the law register and flipped rapidly. Through the pages. Here, Harlan Gibbs, clerk to Moresby and Howell, certified 1889, no family listed, no home address registered in the last census. A ghost, I muttered. Holmes smiled thinly. Not a ghost, a shadow, and shadows don't vanish, they only follow. He turned toward the window, where the city lights flickered distantly in the fog. I intend to find him, Watson, before he circles us as he did poor Baxter. The path may have led in circles, but ours must break that pattern and end in truth. The next morning broke grey and unpromising, with a slow drizzle settling over the city like a veil of uncertainty. Holmes had not slept, of that I was certain. Though he had sat for some hours in apparent repose, I knew the subtle signs, the stiff stillness of his limbs, the slight twitch of his left eyebrow when thought absorbed him. By the time I rose, he had already gone through the registry of legal clerks, a stack of post office ledgers, and a curious collection of municipal work records, all gathered from his many quiet allies in various corners of London bureaucracy. Harlan. Gibbs is no ordinary clerk, Holmes said as I sat at the breakfast table. He has had 6 listed addresses in the past 10 years, none of which he resided at more than a season. He served 4 firms, never more than 2 years at each, always departing with good references and yet never remaining long enough to raise suspicion. Transient yet invisible, I said. Holmes nodded. Which suggests one of 2 things, either a man with secrets or a man whose profession is concealment. I stirred my tea absently. You believe he is an agent? Of a sort, but not government. No, his work has been freelance. The kind of man solicitors keep quietly, to do what they themselves cannot. Deliver letters that ought not be posted. Apply pressure to the reluctant. Gather rumors before litigation. And in some cases perhaps erase what should not be known. And Moresby employed him to frighten Baxter, I said, but he chose to silence him instead. Or, Holmes said, rising and pacing, he saw an opportunity and took it. Remember, Baxter was not merely a risk to Moresby. He was the key to a decades-old deceit. If Gibbs understood what was in the folio, he may have chosen to remove the one man who could authenticate it. You believe he killed Baxter to take possession of that knowledge. More than that, I believe he still intends to profit from it, which means he must make his next move soon before we close in. At that moment, a sharp knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a telegram upon a salver. Holmes read it silently, then handed it to me. Gibbs sighted near Limehouse Wharf matches description, followed to derelict warehouse, awaiting orders. Lestrade. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Come, Watson. The shadow has found its edge. Let us see where it ends. The journey to Limehouse was swift and silent. The rain had thickened into a steady curtain, making the streets shine and obscuring the outlines of warehouses along the riverfront. At the far end of a narrow quay road we found Lestrade under the shelter of a tilted awning, his coat slick with damp. He went in half an hour ago, the inspector murmured. 3rd warehouse, old shipping storehouse. No one's come out since. Alone? Far. As we know. Holmes narrowed his eyes toward the shadowed doorway. Then he's here for something or someone. Watson, stay close. We advanced toward the building in silence. The iron door stood slightly ajar. Holmes pushed it gently, and we stepped into a cavernous interior that smelled of salt, wood rot, and something else, faintly chemical. The space was filled with crates and broken pallets. Faint light filtered through high, filthy windows. Then, a sound. The scrape of something metal followed by a low cough. We crept forward. As we rounded a stack of crates, we saw him. Harlan Gibbs was crouched by a broken desk, a lantern burning low beside him. His face, when he turned, was thin and fox-like, his hair damp, and a long coat wrapped tightly about him. He held in his hand a sheaf of documents, papers that I recognized instantly as duplicates from Baxter's folio. Holmes stepped forward. "I wouldn't run, Mr. Gibbs. You've been found." Gibbs did not rise. His eyes were sharp and steady, as though he'd expected us. "I knew someone would come," he said. His voice was soft, unhurried. "The moment Moresby was arrested, the game changed. But I didn't think it would be you, Mr. Holmes. A compliment, really." Holmes said nothing. Gibbs continued. "I suppose you think me a murderer. Perhaps I am, but I am also a man who knows the value of truth, the kind that ruins men. Baxter sat on that truth for 20 years. He let a woman be ruined, silenced, forgotten, and when she came to him desperate, he turned her away again." Holmes's voice was low. "Evelyn Fenchurch did return to him then?" "She did," Gibbs said, and now his voice wavered with something almost like fury. "In '89, penniless, ill, he wouldn't even see her. Said it would bring disgrace, that the past was dead. But she gave him the last of what she had, letters, witness statements, names. She begged him to make it." "Right. What did he do with them?" Holmes asked. "Filed them away in the blue folio. He couldn't face the cost of justice. And she died in an almshouse 2 years later." There was silence. Even Lestrade, standing behind us now, said nothing. "She wasn't mad," Gibbs went on. "Not deluded, as Moresby claimed. She was betrayed twice, first by Moresby, then by Baxter. I found her name by chance, buried in an old case. Traced the rest from there." "You killed Baxter," Holmes said quietly. "Not for revenge, but to take what he refused to use. To finish what she started. By what means?" "By exposing it all," Gibbs said. He held up the sheaf. "I've made copies. Every paper, every signature, every dated lie. I'll take it to the press. Let them drag Moresby's name through the mud. Let the world see what was stolen." Holmes stepped closer. "And in doing so, you expose your own crime." Gibbs smiled, faintly. "Do I? Baxter walked into his garden and never walked out. There are no witnesses, no wound, no blood. Just a man with ghosts circling him." I saw Holmes hesitate. For all his devotion to the law, there was something in Gibbs's eyes that held him, not innocence, but conviction, a belief in purpose stronger than fear. Then Lestrade stepped forward, cuffs in hand. "You'll tell the rest to the magistrate." Gibbs made no move to resist. He rose, handed Holmes the folio, and turned to Lestrade with a quiet dignity that surprised me. As we stepped back into the rain, Holmes tucked the documents beneath his coat. "There's justice," I said softly, "and then there's vengeance." "They all wear similar masks," Holmes replied, "but you can always tell them apart by who they leave standing." We returned to Baker Street that evening. The fire was lit, and the rain played gently at the panes. Holmes took the folio to the table and laid it out once more. A story buried for 2 decades, finally given breath. "And what now?" I asked. He looked at me with a tired, thoughtful expression. "Now, Watson, the circle closes. But perhaps, in doing so, it makes a mark others will learn to avoid." The morning following Harlan Gibbs's arrest was unusually still. A grey calm had settled over London, as if the city itself was pausing to consider the weight of what had been uncovered. Holmes sat by the window in his dressing gown, cup untouched, gaze distant. The folio lay open on the table between us, its contents now thoroughly familiar, yet still humming with the faint residue of long-suppressed consequence. "Strange," I said quietly, "how much power these papers carry. Dry legal documents, lines of ink. Yet they unraveled a man, ruined another, and killed a third." Holmes didn't look away from the window. Because they were never merely ink, Watson. They were truth. And truth, when buried, accumulates pressure. Eventually, someone is always fool enough or brave enough to dig it up. And in this case, that was Gibbs. Yes, though I suspect he never began as an idealist. There is something about men who live in other people's margins that twists their sense of right and wrong. But he came to believe in her. That much was genuine. You believe everything he said? Holmes finally turned from the window. Not quite. I believe Miss Fenchurch did return to Baxter. I believe she pleaded her case and was dismissed. But there is one inconsistency that has not left me in peace. He gestured to the last page in the folio, the one with the journal entry Baxter had written after Evelyn's second visit. I knew the words by heart now. She came again, thin, pale, eyes still defiant. She said she had kept the letters from the lady's nurse, that she could prove the amendment was made under coercion. But what could I do? Reopen a wound that Moresby had spent years ensuring would never bleed again? I told her it was too late. She left without another word. Holmes tapped the passage. Baxter said she left empty-handed, and yet Gibbs had those same letters, unless he found them elsewhere. He got them from her, I said. Exactly. Which means she returned once more after Baxter's journal ended. Possibly ill, possibly near the end of her strength. And in that final meeting he gave them back to her. Perhaps guilt moved him. Perhaps he believed she would do nothing with them. But she entrusted them to Gibbs. I frowned. But that contradicts his statement. He said she died in an almshouse 2 years after that last meeting. That's a long time to keep her silence. Holmes was silent a moment, then said, unless she didn't die when he claimed. The thought chilled me. You think Gibbs lied? About her death, very possibly. He may have hidden her, Watson. She may still be alive even now, or she may have lived far longer than he admitted. There's nothing in the official records. Her name vanished after the estate ruling. No death certificate, no burial listing. And if she had lived in hiding, as he implied, she would not have used her name. But why lie about it? To protect her or to preserve the story? If she lived and helped expose the truth, the narrative becomes more complicated, less tidy. But if she died, if she suffered and vanished, then Gibbs becomes the avenger, the final act of a tragedy. Holmes rose, and something about him suggested to me that he preferred the simplicity of martyrdom. He began pacing, energy returning. No, Watson, we are not finished. There's one more thread to pull. He crossed to his desk and retrieved a small pocketbook, one he had lifted quietly from Gibbs's belongings during the arrest. Holmes had said nothing of it at the time, but now he opened it carefully and flipped to the final pages. A list, he murmured. Initials, locations, payments. He pointed to one entry. E.F. Ashbridge Home, 1891. 4 tens. I blinked. That's the year before she was supposedly dead. Precisely. The Ashbridge Home is a convalescent house on the outskirts of Hampstead, run by a religious order. A quiet place, anonymous. Ideal for someone who wished to disappear. He was already pulling on his coat. Come, Watson. Let us see whether Evelyn Fenchurch truly vanished, or whether she merely stepped into the one place no one thought to look. The Ashbridge Home stood behind tall hedges and iron gates, its brick walls ivy-covered, its grounds tidy and hushed. A sister opened the door, a mild-faced woman with intelligent eyes. Holmes presented a fabricated name and a charitable interest in long-term residents. She smiled faintly and admitted us. The records go back quite a way, she said as she led us to a narrow room lined with shelves. We try to preserve what we can. Holmes poured through the ledgers, fingers moving quickly. Then he stopped. Here. March 1891. Evelyn Fordham, lodger, private patronage, confined to convalescent wing, admitted in poor condition, recovered. Partially by August. Fordham, a name close enough to Fenchurch to preserve the initials. My heart quickened. He turned the page. Discharged September. Forwarding address, blank. The sister looked over Holmes's shoulder. Ah, yes, I remember her. Pale woman, very quiet, hard eyes, but grateful in her way. Someone came to fetch her. A man, mid-30s. She said nothing, only nodded and went with him. A man? I asked. Thin, dark-haired. I assumed it was a brother or perhaps a solicitor. Holmes looked at me. Gibbs, I said. Almost certainly. Back on the road, Holmes's expression was unreadable. So she lived, recovered, left under Gibbs's care. And then, he glanced at the sky. I do not know. She may have gone abroad, changed her name, or simply lived quietly, letting him act on her behalf. Either way, she placed her legacy in his hands. We returned to Baker Street as the rain began again, soft and persistent. Lestrade arrived later with word that Moresby had formally confessed to coercing Lady Fairfax's will, under the pretext of protecting the estate. He had done so by influencing both Baxter and the physician attending her, promising generous shares in return for silence. Self-preservation, he said, Lestrade grunted. Tried to justify it by claiming Lady Fairfax had gone senile, but the nurse's old letters, those sealed in the folio, prove otherwise. And Gibbs? I asked. In holding. No remorse, but no resistance either. He says justice has been served. Said if you wanted to find her, you would. But he wouldn't say where she is now. Holmes only nodded. After Lestrade departed, the flat grew quiet. I watched Holmes return the folio to its envelope, seal it carefully, and set it in the drawer, by his desk. This case, I said after a while, was not like the others. No stolen jewels, no masked intruder, just people, bound together by guilt and silence. And secrets, Holmes added, the kind that do not remain buried, no matter how deeply placed. He rose and stood by the fire, hands clasped behind his back. I think Evelyn Fenchurch will not be found again, he said softly. I think she has had enough of being seen. But the truth of her pain, her persistence, that remains. And in the end, Watson, it was her shadow that outlived them all. I said nothing, and for a long time we listened only to the sound of the rain tapping gently at the window panes, like a hand knocking not to enter, but to remind. It was 2 days after our visit to the Ashbridge home when the final stirrings of the case emerged, not from the courts or the police, but through the delicate machinery of silence being replaced by whispers. Word of Edwin Moresby's confession reached the legal circles first. Then came the quieter acknowledgements, solicitors retracting previous cases, retired clerks stepping forward with vague admissions, and a sudden flurry of inquiries into the management of estates tied to his name. It was, Holmes noted dryly, the sound of rats abandoning a ship only just acknowledged as sinking. I found Holmes that morning buried in correspondence, letters from Lestrade, from minor barristers who had touched the edge of the Fairfax matter, and one cryptic envelope with no return address, bearing only a single folded sheet. He handed it to me without a word. She thanks you, and asks not to be found again. H.G., I looked up. She lives. Holmes nodded once. Yes, somewhere outside the grasp of the names and records that failed her before. And Gibbs, for all his sins, has done precisely what she asked. I considered the implications. Then she truly has what she always wanted. Not vengeance, not even restitution, just escape. Freedom, Holmes corrected. Freedom, at last, to choose her own absence. He folded the note and dropped it into the fire. We might have left the case at that, but Holmes was never a man to set aside a thread that still had the faintest tension in it. And though Evelyn Fenchurch had vanished into the quiet place beyond reach, the path that led to her had not been walked by her alone. I believe, Holmes said that afternoon as we walked along the Thames embankment, that there remains a final participant we have not yet spoken to. Who? I asked, though the answer was already forming in my mind. Dr. Cedric Halberd, the attending physician to Lady Fairfax in 1871. His name appeared in the probate review. It was he who declared her of sound mind when the will was amended. But surely the man is dead by now. Holmes smiled faintly. Not at all. Retired, yes, living in Bath. I made inquiries. A friend at the Royal College of Physicians confirmed he still maintains a modest residence and a more than modest cellar of port. I believe we should pay him a visit, and so we did. The journey to Bath was uneventful. the scenery streaked with spring rain and early blooms just beginning to edge into view. We arrived late in the afternoon and found Dr. Halbert in a warm sitting room lined with medical books, antique instruments, and a fire that lent the whole place a cheer at odds with the reason for our visit. He was a man of advanced years, but sharp gaze. After a polite introduction, Holmes did not delay. "You attended Lady Evangeline Fairfax in the final months of her life," he said, pouring the doctor a small sherry. "You declared her mentally competent when she amended her." "Will?" "I did," Halbert said, nodding. "It was not a declaration I made lightly. There was considerable pressure at the time." Holmes's voice remained mild. "From whom?" "Moresby," the old man said with a sigh. "He visited twice that I recall, always polite, always with the air of one expecting compliance. He assured me the amendment was Lady Fairfax's desire, that she had grown disillusioned with Miss Fenchurch, that there were indiscretions. She was very frail by then, but lucid, mostly. I hesitated, but in the end I signed the document." "You had doubts." "I did, and they never left me. But there was no one to oppose it. Miss Fenchurch had been gone for months, dismissed after some disagreement. Lady Fairfax seemed to regret the estrangement, but Moresby insisted it was mutual. I convinced myself it was not my place to interfere." Holmes studied him. "If you had spoken out, would it have changed anything?" Halbert's expression was unreadable. "Perhaps not, but it might have comforted someone. That's the thing about the truth, Mr. Holmes. It doesn't always undo the crime, but it does offer company to the wronged." As we departed, Holmes walked slowly through the Bath streets, lost in thought. He had a habit in such moods of twisting his glove between his fingers, as though coaxing some final knot into undoing. He never imagined the weight of his silence, Holmes said at last, and yet it pressed as heavily on him as any verdict. "It seems strange," I said, "that so much pain came not from the crime itself but from the cowardice around it. The refusal to act." "Precisely. Moresby may have planned the theft, but it was Baxter's weakness, Halbert's silence, and the court's apathy that built the cage around Evelyn Fenchurch. We returned to London the next day, and though the case had reached its formal end, charges filed, documents disclosed, reputations quietly dismantled, Holmes remained unsettled. He spent that evening in his armchair, violin untouched beside him, pipe clamped between his teeth. Though I noticed it had long since gone out, I knew that look well. It meant the mind was turning something over again, finding a new perspective. "What is it?" I asked. "I was thinking about the garden," he said slowly. "The two circles around the tree. I had assumed they were symbolic, a ritual, a manipulation. You think otherwise now?" "I think they were a message." I frowned. "A message to whom?" "To us," he said, "or to anyone who would look closely. Remember the arrangement. 2 full circles, identical, then nothing. But Baxter was meticulous. He knew the pattern, was strange, and still he followed it." "You think he intended it?" "I think he was trying to leave a trail, one that matched the rest of the case. A path that led in circles, not because he was lost, but because he wanted someone to understand. That's what had been done to Evelyn. She had been led in circles, promises, delays, hearings, each turn bringing her back to the same point, nowhere. He was reenacting that, as a kind of confession." The room grew quiet. I sat with that thought a long while until the fire burned low. "He did find his courage then," I said finally. "In the end," Holmes gave a small nod, "and in the end," he replied, "he told the truth in the only way he still could." We let the silence remain after that, not out of solemnity but of respect, for a truth that had waited too long to be heard. And though the case had closed, I could not help but feel that its echo would remain, like the faint trace of footsteps, on dewy grass, circling something long buried at the center of it all. Spring settled fully over London in the days that followed, as if the city had shaken off a long-held breath. Trees began to unfurl their leaves along the edges of Baker Street, and the fog that so often clung to our windows had lifted, replaced by a crisper, brighter air. The case, for all legal purposes, was closed. Edwin Moresby awaited sentencing, his name struck from the rolls of the Law Society. Harlan Gibbs, though charged with manslaughter, had thus far offered no defense, his only demand being that Evelyn Fenchurch's documents be preserved and made public. And as for Miss Fenchurch herself, if indeed she still bore that name, she remained unseen, untouched, and by her own request untraceable. Yet Holmes was not content. He made no mention of the case to visiting clients. He returned to his monographs, his chemical experiments, even allowed Lestrade to consult him on a stolen necklace in Hampstead, but all of it had the feel of distraction, not pursuit. There was something unfinished, and I knew better than to ask what it was until he chose to voice it. That voice came at last one quiet morning when the post arrived. Holmes had been sitting at his desk, examining a smear of ash beneath his lens, something to do with Russian tobacco, or perhaps railway soot, when he opened a cream-colored envelope addressed in unfamiliar script. His eyes scanned the contents swiftly, then once again, slower. He set the page down without a word. I picked it up, with a glance of permission. "Mr. Holmes, you do not know me. My name is Clara Hensley. I served Mr. Archibald Baxter as housemaid until his death. I did not lie to you when we spoke, but I did not tell you all I knew. There is something I found. I believe it may help explain why Mr. Baxter went into the garden that night and perhaps what he meant to do. Please come. I will speak only to you. I no longer trust anyone else." CHI set the letter down slowly. She was the one who found the body. "And perhaps more than that," Holmes said. "She claimed she heard a sound, a humming or whispering. But now she writes as one who has seen something more. You suspect she's in danger? I suspect she's afraid, which in some ways is worse. We must go at once." We reached the small cottage near Croydon, Clara's new residence, before noon. It was modest, tucked at the edge of a wooded lane far removed from the iron railings and closed gates of Highbury Lane. Clara greeted us herself, her face pale, the expression of someone who had spent too long doubting their own memory. "I wanted to forget all of it," she said, as she ushered us in. "After Mr. Baxter's death, I left the house within the week. I couldn't sleep there. I couldn't even stay in London. But there's something I kept. I didn't show it to the police, and I didn't understand what it meant until I read about the trial." She led us to the sitting room, where a small table had been cleared for one item alone, a dark, leather-bound journal. "This was in Mr. Baxter's study," she said, "tucked behind the books on the lowest shelf. I only found it while cleaning after everything happened. I thought it was an old account ledger, but when I opened it..." Holmes had already lifted the journal, flipping carefully through the pages. They were filled in Baxter's hand, dates, observations, private notes. He paused on a passage and read aloud. "March 15th, received another letter, unsigned. This makes the 4th. She knows everything, the dates, the folio, even the tree. I thought I had hidden the details too well. Either she is Evelyn, or someone who has studied her grief with more care than I ever did. She says I must meet her, in the garden, that I must walk the pattern. She says if I do, she will forgive me. I do not believe her, but still, I have kept the shoes ready." Holmes turned the page. March 23rd. I dreamt of the garden again. The tree, the circles, the silence, no voice, only the turning. I wonder if I will know the difference when the real moment comes. If she is alive, she will understand. If not, then perhaps I walk for my own penance. Holmes's mouth drew into a thin line as he turned the final written page. The last entry, dated 2 days before Baxter's death, was just one sentence. "I have failed to be brave in life. Let me be honest in death." He closed the journal slowly. "It was never just fear," Holmes said. "He knew who was calling him, or believed he did, and he chose to meet it. He chose to face the consequence, not to run, but to walk it, step by step, in the only form of absolution he could imagine." Clara sat down opposite us, her hands trembling. "Then he knew he would die. I think," Holmes said quietly, "that he hoped he would not. But he prepared himself if he did." She looked toward the window, blinking quickly. "I wasn't there when it happened," she said. "I thought I heard someone talking, but I didn't go out. I was afraid. And I've wondered ever since if that made me a coward." Holmes stood and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "No, you were not the one who failed him. You were the one who remembered. As we made our way back to the station, I remained quiet, the sound of train wheels in the distance growing louder. Holmes stared ahead, eyes sharp again, but softened somehow, as if something in the last note of Baxter's journal had altered even the pitch of his mind. You once said the dead leave clues, I said. That they speak, not through voices, but through what they leave behind. They do, Holmes replied. And sometimes, Watson, it is not the murder that tells the story, but the choice to die at all. In this case, Baxter gave us both the key and the lock. The question was whether we would read it. And now, Holmes looked to the horizon, now the path is complete. He chose to step into the past he helped create, and Evelyn, wherever she is, will know that he didn't walk those circles in defiance. He walked them in apology. We said nothing more. The whistle of the train called across the fields and we turned toward it, leaving behind the last page of a mystery whose ending had, in truth, been written long before we arrived. It was a week later, on an afternoon touched by rare warmth, that Holmes and I found ourselves once again at Baker Street, the long shadow of the path that led in circles now behind us, at least in the eyes of the public. The newspapers had offered their simplified summaries: disgraced solicitor convicted in inheritance fraud, legal clerk faces trial after confession, scandal revives long-buried will. Yet none truly grasped the quiet agony that had wound through the affair, nor the strange elegance of the truth that Holmes had uncovered. He was by the window as usual, that distant look returning, though this time it held no unease. Only a stillness. The case was not about a murder, he said suddenly, eyes still turned outward. I looked up from my notes. No? No. It was about a wound left to fester, a promise broken so thoroughly it infected everything it touched. He turned, gesturing vaguely to the table where the folio, now sealed and marked, awaited delivery to the archives. Baxter didn't die for what he did. He died for what he didn't do. I set down my pen. Do you regret the way it ended? He tilted his head. In the strictest sense, justice was served. Moresby will not practice law again. Gibbs will not walk free for some time, though I imagine his sentence will not be a long one. As for Evelyn Fenchurch, he paused, voice softening. She escaped, or perhaps she simply let go. Do you believe she's truly alive out there somewhere? Holmes didn't answer immediately. Then he reached into the drawer of his desk and produced a folded envelope, worn, creased from handling. He passed it to me in silence. The letter was short, written in the same firm, elegant script as the earlier anonymous message. Mr. Holmes, I have read your conclusions. Thank you for understanding that the answers I sought were never meant for courts. Archibald was not cruel, only afraid. We all carry our choices longer than we expect. I am not Evelyn Fenchurch anymore. I am only someone who has outlived a chapter. Please do not search for me further. The truth is enough. Let it rest. There, Chef, I folded the letter and returned it. She trusts you, I said. She trusts herself, Holmes replied. Finally. There was a pause, then he gave a rare, tired smile. Do you recall, Watson, the first time we encountered a garden in a case? The naval treaty? The hydrangeas? Of course. Then we saw the truth hidden among flowers. This time we found it where no flowers grew, a bare patch of earth, a tree, and footprints that went nowhere. But they did go somewhere in the end, I said. Yes. Holmes looked out again. They led to a choice. A man trying for once to walk toward what he had always run from, and in doing so, he left us not with mystery, but with meaning. He turned abruptly and crossed to the table, where he struck a match and lit his pipe. A long draw, a satisfied sigh of smoke, and so, he said, with a finality that echoed softly through the room, the circle is complete. We said nothing more that day. Outside, the city hummed with the usual indifference of traffic and trade, unaware that in one quiet corner of London, a circle had indeed closed, not only around a crime but around the ache of a forgotten life now at last remembered.